I remember the cold of the basement floor against my cheek. It was a specific cold, the kind that comes from concrete poured in 1987, the year this house was built, the year my father got his first board appointment at Massachusetts General. The chill had a mineral quality to it, almost metallic. I would later learn that I was tasting blood, not cold, but in those first seconds I couldn't distinguish between the two. My left arm lay beneath me at an angle that would have been physically impossible had I been conscious enough to permit it, and I understood, in the non-linguistic way that pain communicates, that something fundamental had broken. 13 stairs. I counted them as I lay there, not out of any methodical impulse but because my mind seized on this task as a way to avoid the larger calculation of what had happened and what it meant. 13 wooden stairs, stained dark walnut, leading up from the recreation room to the kitchen. I had helped my father install the handrail when I was 22, home from my first year of medical school, and we had measured twice and drilled the holes with a precision that felt like love at the time. Now that same handrail offered no comfort, offered nothing but its geometry, its wrongness as a landmark in a landscape that had suddenly become hostile. Julianne's footsteps retreated upstairs almost immediately. I remember her speed with a clarity that will probably never fade. She had been standing over my bag, the small leather crossbody that I carried to the hospital and left on the kitchen counter because I was tired and wanted to shower before dinner. My wallet was in my hand when I found her. Not my wallet exactly, the cash from my wallet. $470 that I had withdrawn for the month, money that came from a resident's salary that is already inadequate, but that becomes catastrophically inadequate when your parents decide they have leverage and begin to extract rent from your life in the form of conditional support. She was rifling through the bills with the focused aggression of someone searching for something specific, and when she realized I was there, when she felt my presence the way animals feel the presence of something unwanted in their space, she turned with her face already arranged into that expression of injured innocence that had, over many years, become her default mode. I asked her what she was doing. The sentence was simple, almost conversational, though I could hear the fatigue in my own voice. I had worked a 30-hour shift. I had admitted 7 patients with pneumonia, 2 with sepsis, 1 with a presentation that looked like acute MI but turned out to be severe anxiety and a viral infection. I was standing in my mother's kitchen in a house that had never quite been mine, and my sister was stealing from me while my parents were at a fundraiser for the new pediatrics wing. She said something. I don't remember the words, only the quality of them. Defensive, contemptuous, already constructing a narrative in which I was the unreasonable one. I moved toward her. The intention was simple and non-violent. I wanted to take my money back. I wanted her to leave. I wanted to go upstairs and shower and sleep for perhaps 14 hours and then return to the hospital and resume the work of trying to keep people alive, work that felt increasingly clean compared to the work of maintaining my life in this house. What happened next had the quality of inevitability. I can see it now as a sequence of physical events divorced from intention. Her hand extended, her palm connecting with my shoulder, my body's backward motion, my heel catching on the edge of the first stair, my momentum carrying me through a series of impacts that my body registered as discrete events but that my mind would later compress into a single continuous trauma. The handrail, the one we had installed together, slipped through my fingers. My right hand caught at the corner of the stairwell, and I heard something crack before I felt it. Then I was falling, then I was still, and the cold of the floor was the first honest thing that had happened to me in months. By the time my parents came home, 3 hours later, the narrative had already been constructed. Julianne had called them. I later learned she had told them I had fallen while carrying laundry from the bedroom, that I had misjudged the first step, that it had been an accident and nobody's fault. She had put her tone in exactly the right register, concerned but not hysterical, factual but not cold. She had called an ambulance first, she said, but then I had refused to go, insisting it was nothing serious. She had ice on my wrist. She had helped me to the living room couch. She was the devoted younger sister helping her injured older sister, and the only evidence against this version was the true evidence of what had happened, which was locked inside my body in the form of pain and the shape of my broken bones. My father came downstairs first. He was still wearing his dark suit from the fundraiser, and he carried with him the particular energy of a man who had just spent an evening receiving thanks from important people. He smelled like expensive scotch and the specific cologne he had worn since my childhood. He looked at me on the couch with an expression that moved through several stages in quick succession: concern, assessment, and then something I recognized as calculation. The calculating look. I had seen it before, many times, always before moments when my life became a problem to be managed rather than a reality to be addressed. Your mother called the ambulance, Julianne said. But Hannah said she didn't want to go. It took me a moment to understand what she was doing. She was establishing the timeline in a specific way. Responsible family member calls ambulance. Stubborn family member refuses. Nobody was refusing now. Refusal was in the past tense, already a decision made, no further discussion necessary. My father sat on the edge of the coffee table, the one my mother had selected from a catalogue, with the same attention to aesthetic detail that she gave to nearly every choice in her life. "Where does it hurt?" he asked, and his tone was gentle, genuinely paternal, exactly the tone that had made him effective with his own patients for 4 decades. "My wrist," I said. "My ribs. I need to go to the hospital." "Can you move your fingers?" I could. All of them. I demonstrated this because he had asked it, and in that moment, his question felt more important than the pain, which had by that time become almost abstract, a quality of the air rather than a specific thing my body was experiencing. "Good," he said. "Very good. That's a good sign." "My ribs might be broken," I said. "We'll see," he said. "Your mother has some ice and some strong ibuprofen. We'll see how you're doing in an hour. If it's getting worse, we can reassess." I understood that we would not reassess. I had been through this before, though not exactly like this. There had been other incidents, other injuries, other moments when my body had been damaged and then treated by my father in the privacy of this house, with his medical expertise deployed in service of family reputation rather than actual medical need. A fractured collarbone at 23 that he had me wear a sling for without imaging. An injury to my eye that he had examined with his otoscope, determined was not vision-threatening, and then advised me to keep makeup on it. A time when my mother had pushed me against a counter and I had bruised my hip so severely I could barely walk, and my father had given me muscle relaxants from his office pharmacy and told me to stay home. "Dad," I said, "I think I need imaging." He looked at me with an expression that combined disappointment and something harder to name. "Hannah," he said, and his voice had shifted into a register I knew very well. "Do you understand what it would mean if you went to the hospital? Do you understand what people would say? I have a reputation. Your mother has a reputation. Julianne is applying to law schools. Is that what you want? To embarrass us like this?" I fell, I said, and I heard myself agreeing with the narrative even as I was being confronted with it. The ease with which I did this frightened me, though not as much as the alternative frightened me. Which was true and complete honesty about what had happened. "You fell," he confirmed. "That's what Julianne said. An accident. Completely understandable. No shame in that. But you understand that if you go to the hospital and tell them you fell, and they ask questions, and they call in their administrators, and it becomes a whole thing, people talk. Your mother and I have worked very hard to maintain a certain kind of life. Certainly you can appreciate that." I could appreciate it. That was the problem. I had been trained, over many years, to appreciate it in a very deep way. To feel the weight of it. To understand that my existence was somewhat contingent on my willingness to absorb certain truths and then remain silent about them. "I'll stay home," I said. He nodded. He stood. He told me he would get me something for the pain, and then he left the room. Julianne was still there, sitting in the leather chair near the window with a small, private expression of satisfaction that she did not quite bother to hide. She knew what had been established. She knew, as I did, that she had won this particular round not because she was stronger, though she was younger and had that on her side, but because she had understood faster than I had what weapons were available in this family, and how to deploy them. The hospital was 40 minutes away by car. I knew every physician in the ER by name. Some of them knew me as a junior colleague. Some of them knew me as that resident from internal medicine who was competent enough but seemed exhausted in a way that suggested something more than the normal exhaustion of residency. None of them were there that night, in the early stages, because I didn't go. I told myself the story my father had given me. I took the ibuprofen and the ice. I remained in my family's house while my ribs ground against each other and my wrist swelled so severely that by the next morning I could not fully close my hand. I called the residency clinic before my shift. I told them I had fallen and injured my wrist and might need to modify my schedule for a day or two. They asked where I had fallen. I said at home. They didn't ask for details. Details were not something that residences typically requested. In the medical hierarchy, we operated on the assumption that people told the truth or at least something close enough to it that pursuing the margins was not productive. I was wrong about that. Many people did not tell the truth. Many of us were lying, but the lie was small enough and socially convenient enough that it was accepted without scrutiny. I went to the hospital and worked a 15-hour shift with a fractured wrist and broken ribs. I learned that I could do this, could function through significant pain, could take adequate histories and perform adequate physical exams and make adequate clinical decisions while my body was expressing its trauma in steady, comprehensive ways. I learned that my competence was independent of my integrity, and that I could maintain one while abandoning the other. I learned that many people knew something was wrong with me, and no one asked directly. These seemed like important lessons, the kind of lessons that shape a life, though it took me much longer to understand that they were the wrong lessons, and that learning them would cost me more than I realized. My father called me twice that week. The first time was to remind me that my rent would be late if I wasn't careful with my finances. The second time was to suggest, in the gentlest possible way, that if I continued to have accidents in his house, I might consider finding another place to stay. This was presented not as a threat but as a practical observation, a friend offering sound advice. He had a gift for this particular rhetorical move. He could say almost anything, anything at all, and frame it as simple reality, the laws of nature operating in space, not the deliberate exertion of force by a person toward another person. I had lived with this version of my father for all of my life. I had watched him operate at the hospital with the same tone, the same manner, absolutely certain of his rightness, absolutely committed to the preservation of his own image. Absolutely devoted to the idea that his vision of how things should be was simply how things were. He had been selected, young in his career, to serve on important committees. He had been asked to speak at national conferences. His opinions on how to structure residency programs and how to handle certain kinds of cases were sought after and valued. Somewhere in the architecture of his personality was a fundamental assumption that the world had been arranged correctly with him at the center of it, and that anyone who challenged this arrangement was either confused or deliberately malicious. My mother had long ago decided to organize her life around this arrangement. She had the gentler job. She smoothed things, minimized conflicts, preserved the aesthetic of family harmony even when the actual substance of family life was deteriorating. She had developed certain looks over the years. A look that meant to don't pursue this. A look that meant to your father is not going to change his mind. A look that meant to if you insist on your version of reality, you will be the one who has violated family peace. She deployed these looks with the subtlety of a surgeon deploying instruments. My sister had learned these looks. She had learned that compliance with the family narrative was the path to favor and stability. I had learned them too, but I had also, somewhere around my 20th year, begun to resent them. And in my resentment I had become, in my family's view, difficult. It was my sister who was the golden child. This had always been true, from childhood, though the quality of her goldenness had changed as she aged. As a child, she was golden because she was beautiful and compliant and good at school without effort. As a teenager, she was golden because she was smart and ambitious and had the kind of emotional intensity that my parents could interpret as passion. Now, at 25, she was golden because she was applying to law schools and because she could generate crises that required family attention while maintaining the appearance of being the victim in those crises. I had never been golden. I was competent, which was valued. I was obedient, which was expected. But I was also somewhat separate, something in my psychology that resisted full merger with the family's narrative about itself. My injury healed incorrectly. The wrist fracture, untreated with proper imaging and immobilization, caused a subtle misalignment that I would not fully understand for several more years. The ribs healed, but not before the fractured edges had created scar tissue that would cause me chronic pain with any pressure to that side of my chest. These were the kinds of consequences that emerge not from a single dramatic moment, but from the way that moment is handled in the hours and days afterward. Proper treatment would have prevented both of these. My father's way of handling it created a different future, one that was subtly wrong in ways I would notice for the rest of my life. It was 2 weeks later that I finally went to the emergency department. It wasn't because of anything my family did. It was because of a patient, a woman named Catherine, who came in with injuries similar to my own. She had the fractured ribs and the fractured wrist. She had the story about falling. She had the expression in her eyes that I was beginning to understand meant that the story about falling was not entirely true. I was working that night with a senior attending named Dr. Meredith Collins, and I watched the way she examined Catherine. She was meticulous. She took her time. She noted the specific patterns of bruising, the location of the injuries, the constellation of trauma that pointed towards something other than an accidental fall. "How did this happen?" Dr. Collins asked Catherine, and her voice was gentle but direct. "I fell down the stairs," Catherine said. "Which stairs?" "At home." "Were you alone?" Catherine didn't answer. That was the answer. Dr. Collins seemed to understand. She continued with her examination, but something had shifted in the room. This was no longer a clinical encounter that could be smoothly processed and discharged. This was an encounter that had branched into a more complicated space. One in which the patient's safety, not her narrative consistency, was the primary concern. I stood across from Dr. Collins while she examined Catherine, and I felt something very strange happening in my own body. It was as though Catherine's pain was activating pain that I had been carrying but had become so accustomed to that I had stopped noticing it. My wrist had never actually healed correctly. My ribs still hurt. When I lay on my left side at night, I would feel the specific location of the fracture, a point of pressure that my body had never fully resolved. But I had integrated these things into my understanding of myself. They were just how my body was. They were the cost of maintaining my family's reputation. They were nothing compared to what would happen if I spoke the truth. Except, watching Dr. Collins with Catherine, I began to understand that they were not nothing. That they were, in fact, something quite significant. That the cost of maintaining my family's reputation was not actually being paid by my family at all. It was being paid by me, extracted from my body and my psychological integrity in increments that were small enough not to be initially noticeable but that accumulated into a kind of violence that was nonetheless real. After Catherine was transferred to the hospital's safe housing program, after she had agreed to press charges and to work with victim advocacy, I found Dr. Collins in the physician's lounge. I don't know what I intended to say. I remember that my heart was beating very fast and that my hands were shaking in a way that felt disconnected from any decision I had made. I remember that when I opened my mouth, what came out was not a casual question but something more like a confession, or the beginning of one. I was pushed, I said. Down the stairs. At my parents' house. 2 weeks ago. The words felt foreign, as though I were saying something in a language I had never actually spoken, though I had understood it passively my entire life. Dr. Collins was looking at me with an expression of complete attention. She did not look surprised. She did not look judgmental. She looked, in fact, like someone who had been waiting for this to happen, as though she had seen something in my face or my manner during the Catherine encounter that suggested I might have my own reason for being so interested. Are you safe? She asked. I had to think about what this question meant. Safety, I had come to understand, was not a simple state. I was not being actively harmed every moment. I had shelter and food and a position that was respected by strangers. I was not in immediate physical danger from anyone except my sister, and my sister's violence was episodic rather than constant. But I was not safe in any meaningful sense. I was living in a state of careful negotiation, of constant attention to the moods and needs and threats of the people who surrounded me. I was conducting an internal calculus about what I could say and what I should hide. I was not safe. No, I said. We need to report this, Dr. Collins said. You're aware of that? I know. It will be complicated. I know that too. She said she would make the call, and that I should plan to speak to someone from the hospital's legal and administrative department, and that there were resources available to me. She said these things in a tone of absolute matter-of-factness, as though they were simply the next steps that followed from the facts I had presented. There was nothing in her manner that suggested I had done something wrong, that I was being disloyal to my family, that this was anything other than what should happen when one person injured another person. There was no room in her presentation of the situation for the narrative that I had been carrying. That I was complicit in my own abuse. That I had some responsibility for what had happened to me. That the real tragedy was what this would do to my family. I made a decision very quickly after that conversation. I decided to tell the truth. I decided that the cost of telling the truth was probably high, but the cost of continuing to lie had become, in some barely quantifiable way, higher. I decided to see a lawyer. I decided to document the history of injuries. I decided to speak to the detective who would inevitably be assigned to the case. I decided to disrupt the careful machinery that my family had spent years constructing in order to preserve its image and its reputation. What I did not decide was what would come afterward. That was a thing that happened to me, not a thing that I chose. When my father arrived at the hospital, and he arrived very quickly, because he had friends in administration who had called him the moment my statement was recorded, he did not look shocked. He looked affronted, which was worse in some ways. He looked like a man who had been treated with a profound rudeness by someone he had been kind to. His hair was perfect. He was wearing the kind of suit that cost more than I made in a month. He was accompanied by a lawyer, a woman who had done work for the hospital in the past and who thus represented a kind of pre-existing relationship with the institution that could be leveraged. Hannah, he said, when he was allowed to speak to me in a small meeting room with a victim advocate present. We need to talk about why you would do this to us. The pronouns struck me. Us. Not to yourself, but to us. The injury that I had sustained had somehow been reconstructed, in his mind, as an injury that I was inflicting on the family by speaking about it. The violence had become my revelation of the violence. That was a particular kind of logical inversion that I would have found fascinating if it weren't also being deployed as a weapon. I didn't do this to you, I said. Julianne did this to me. Julianne was upset, he said. Your mother was worried about you. The situation escalated. But all of this could be handled privately. We don't need to involve the courts and the police, Anne. He gestured vaguely at the victim advocate, strangers. I'm involved, the victim advocate said quietly. I'm not a stranger. I work for the hospital. My father looked at her as though she had spoken in another language. I'm trying to help my daughter, he said, with the tone of someone explaining something very simple to someone of limited comprehension. The family can handle this. We always have. What he meant was, we always have hidden this. We have always managed to keep it quiet. We have always found a way to make it disappear. Why are you breaking the agreement that you were never explicitly told you had made, but that you understood from the texture of every family interaction that you had to maintain? I want to press charges, I said. Against your sister? Hannah, do you understand what this will do to her future? She's applying to law schools. These things become public record. This will be on her record. Is that what you want? Do you want to ruin her life? I felt something very clear move through me at that moment, something like clarity cutting through the fog of obligation and guilt that had been my emotional landscape for as long as I could remember. I said, she pushed me down the stairs. She broke my ribs. This isn't about her feelings. This is about what happened. What happened was an accident, he said. That's the only thing that needs to be true. He left shortly after that. The lawyer remained. She had various documents that she wanted me to review, various explanations of what it would mean to pursue this versus to accept a private arrangement. The hospital, apparently, had ways of handling these things. There were settlements that could be negotiated. There were guarantees that could be made about my continued employment as long as I was willing to be reasonable. There were private therapists who specialized in family reconciliation. There were ways to make all of this go away, and my father could facilitate those ways if I would simply agree to cooperate. The detective who interviewed me later that day did not have a nice suit or a lawyer or the weight of institutional authority behind her. She had a notebook and a steady, intelligent gaze and a manner that suggested she had been through this particular conversation many times before. Her name was Rosa Alvarez. And she asked me to tell her exactly what had happened, and she wrote down the details without expression, without editorial comment, without any sense that what she was hearing was unusual or that I was being unreasonable. Has this happened before? She asked, when I finished describing the fall. I told her about the collarbone, about the eye injury, about other incidents that I had absorbed and minimized and explained away. I told her about the pattern of injuries that all had simple explanations except that there were too many of them, and they were always inflicted by my sister, and they were always handled privately, and there was always a cost to speaking about them in terms other than the narrative that my family had constructed. Has your father ever been physically violent with you? The detective asked. No, I said. Not directly. But he has prevented me from getting medical care. He has threatened financial consequences if I speak about what happened. He has told me that his career and my family's reputation are more important than my safety. Those are threats, the detective said. Those are coercive acts. I had not quite thought of them that way before, or rather, I had thought of them that way intellectually but had not fully permitted myself to feel the reality of them emotionally. Coercion. A word that applied to other families, other situations. Not mine. Not people like my father, who had a medical degree and a position of authority and a certain kind of social standing. Surely there was something different about my situation that made it less clear, less obviously wrong. Are you afraid of your sister? The detective asked. I was. I had not realized how afraid of her I was until she asked the question, at which point the fear revealed itself to be comprehensive, a constant background condition of my emotional life that I had somehow not registered as fear. She was smaller than me. She was younger. She was not someone I would have identified as dangerous if we were strangers. But we were not strangers. We were family, which meant that the relationship between us was asymmetrical in ways that had nothing to do with our relative physical strength. Yes, I said. Very much. Are you afraid of your parents? This was the harder question. I loved my parents, or I thought I did, or I had been trained to love them in a way that was so foundational to my sense of self that separating my own feelings from my training was nearly impossible. But was I afraid of them? Yes. I was afraid of my father's disappointment and the way it could reshape the financial reality of my life. I was afraid of my mother's withdrawal and the sense that I had failed her, had betrayed her into a kind of loneliness by not protecting the family's image. I was afraid of what it would mean to be the person who had destroyed my family's reputation. I was afraid that they would never speak to me again. I was afraid that they would speak to me only to tell me how much damage I had caused. Yes, I said. I'm afraid of them too. The detective closed her notebook. She said that the next steps would be filing a report, that the district attorney's office would review the case, that I would be contacted by them. She said that what my family did in response would be important information, that she would be monitoring the situation. She said, very quietly, that I had done something that was both very brave and very difficult, and that what happened next was not my responsibility. It was the responsibility of the people who had hurt me. It was the responsibility of the system to protect me. It was not my job to make sure that my family's reputation survived, or that my sister's law school applications went smoothly, or that my father's position at the hospital remained secure. It was my job to be safe and to tell the truth about what had happened to me. By the time I was discharged from the hospital, things had become clear. First, that my family was not going to accept my account of what had happened without a significant battle. Second, that this battle would not be abstract or contained, but would impact my daily life in concrete and immediate ways. Third, that I would lose my housing and a substantial portion of my financial support by refusing to recant my story. Fourth, that I had a choice about whether all of this was worth it, and that I had made that choice, and that I could not make it without completely destroying the person I had been trying to become. The retaliation began within a day. My father called the residency program director. He expressed concerns about my mental stability. He suggested that the incident had been a psychological episode, that I had fallen and then constructed a narrative in which I was a victim of family violence, that this suggested a concerning break from reality. He said these things with the tone of a concerned parent who was troubled by his daughter's behavior and who simply wanted to ensure she was receiving appropriate mental health support. He framed his concerns as care. He weaponized his relationship with institutional authority to create doubt about the accuracy of my perceptions. My residency director called me into her office. She was a kind woman, competent and fair in her management of the program, and I watched her struggle with the position my father had put her in. She had a letter from a distinguished physician saying that his daughter was having a mental health crisis. She had that same daughter claiming abuse. The easier choice, I understood, was to doubt the daughter. The daughter was just a resident. The father was someone with actual power in her world. Are you okay? She asked. Your father seems concerned that something more serious might be happening. Something serious did happen, I said. I was injured. I reported it. I know. I read the incident report. But your father suggested that perhaps the perception of how it happened might be distorted. My perception of the staircase was not distorted, I said. The medical evidence of my injuries was not distorted. The detective investigated the claim. Unless you think I broke my own ribs intentionally. She was quiet for a moment. I'm going to have you talk to someone in occupational health, she said. Just to ensure that everything is okay and that you have the support you need. That's not a formal action. It's just a precaution. What it was, in fact, was a way of creating a record that suggested there were questions about my stability. What it was a way of allowing doubt to enter the space where previously there had been confidence. What it was institutional machinery responding to a person with power in a way that did not require belief in his claims, but simply required acceptance of the idea that his claims deserved to be aired. The occupational health provider was a psychologist named Dr. Janet Rodriguez, and she turned out to be one of the most directly helpful people I encountered during this period. She asked me the same questions the detective had asked, and she listened to my answers, and then she said something that seemed to surprise her even as she said it. "Your story is coherent," as she said. "Your effect is appropriate to the content of what you're describing. You're not showing signs of depression or psychosis or dissociation or any of the things that would suggest your perception of reality was fundamentally distorted. I'm going to document that, and I'm going to recommend that the residency program support you rather than subject you to increased scrutiny." By then, of course, the documentation was less important than the seed of doubt that had already been planted. People began treating me differently. The attending physicians who had previously been willing to work with me became more formal. The residents who had been friendly became cordial in that way that masks distance. There were scheduling changes that seemed to cluster unpleasant shifts and unpleasant rotations in ways that had not been true before. There was a sense that I had become a liability, that associating too closely with me might compromise their own standing. I was moving around during this time, which made everything harder. I stayed with my Aunt Eleanor Price for 2 weeks, in her house in Cambridge, and she was the first person in my life who seemed to understand what I was talking about when I described what had happened. She was my mother's sister, and she had spent her own youth watching the patterns that had now become my reality. She told me that my grandfather, my mother's father, had been prone to violence, and that my grandmother had managed it by maintaining absolute control over the narrative of her family's life. She said that my mother had learned to be a peacekeeper in an environment in which peacemaking was synonymous with silence. She said that my father had chosen a woman who would allow him to be who he was without resistance, and that once the structure was established, it became self-perpetuating. "He will never accept what you've done," Eleanor said to me, sitting in her kitchen with coffee at 2 a.m. because I could not sleep. "You understand that, don't you? He cannot accept it. Because if he accepts it, the entire structure of how he understands himself and his life collapses. So his choice, from his perspective, is to destroy you before he lets that happen." "Then what do I do?" I asked. "You survive it," as she said. "You get away from all of them. You build a life where you are not dependent on them. You heal. And then, if you want to, maybe much later, you figure out what relationship to them, if any, makes sense." She offered to let me stay with her indefinitely, and the offer was real enough that I was tempted. But I was also aware that living with my aunt while pursuing legal action against my family would only deepen the conflict and pull her further into it. So instead, I found a small studio apartment in a part of Boston that was less expensive than most, and I moved my few possessions there, and I began the process of trying to afford my life on a resident salary without the backup of family money. The financial impact was immediate and substantial. My rent was $1,300 a month, and my take-home pay was approximately $3,300. After rent, taxes, student loans, insurance, utilities, and the most basic food and transportation, there was almost nothing left. I had savings, but not much. If I did not work for more than a few months, I would lose my apartment. The threat was not theoretical. It was written in numbers and timelines. My father understood this, of course. He had helped me understand it, in the years before, by subsidizing my housing and then gradually extracting that subsidy while explaining how difficult it was to maintain such support. He had trained me to see myself as financially fragile, as someone who was dependent on the goodwill of people with more money than I had. He had created a situation in which my own safety seemed to be in conflict with my financial security, which is to say that he had created a situation designed to prevent me from leaving, or if I left, from speaking. The lawyer I hired was a woman named Rebecca Sloan, and she worked in a practice that specialized in domestic abuse cases that involved professional and financial coercion. She was calm and competent and absolutely clear-eyed about what I was facing. She told me that my family would exhaust every legal avenue available to them. They would file countersuits claiming defamation. They would argue that I had fabricated the incident. They would attempt to discredit me by suggesting that my motivation was financial or psychological. They would tie things up in the legal system for years if that's what it took to make the problem go away. The question, she said, is whether you're prepared for that. Because I'm not going to minimize what this is going to be. It's going to be hard. It's going to cost you money and time and emotional energy. It's going to affect your career and your relationships. It's going to make you feel like you're crazy for continuing to push even when it would be easier to accept their settlement offer and move on. I don't want a settlement, I said. I know, she said. But eventually you might. And that's okay. It's okay to change your mind. The only thing that's not okay is to stay in a situation where you're not safe because you're afraid of the consequences of leaving. That's the one thing we're going to make sure doesn't happen. The district attorney who was assigned the case was a young prosecutor named Michael Chen. And he was visibly skeptical during our first meeting. He had read the police report. He had also read the statement from my father and the lawyer, which characterized me as someone with a history of emotional instability who had constructed a fantasy of abuse. He had read the statement from my sister, which admitted to shoving me but characterized it as a momentary loss of control in response to my emotional volatility and aggression. He was looking at a case in which the defendant was the sister of a medical resident and the child of a distinguished physician, and he was trying to figure out whether conviction was possible. I'm not going to lie to you, he said. This is a hard case. Family cases are always hard. The jury will have sympathies for your family. They'll want to believe that people with money and status and professional accomplishments aren't the kinds of people who engage in violence. And they're going to look at you and think, if this really happened, why didn't she just leave? I was pushed down the stairs, I said. I didn't have time to leave. I understand, he said. But the larger pattern, the years of accepting injuries, the hours she spent at her parents' house despite the violence, the fact that she waited 2 weeks to report, all of that is going to be interpreted through a lens that's skeptical. I want you to be prepared for that. What he was telling me was that the truth was not sufficient. The truth required corroboration. It required institutional support. It required a narrative that was not only accurate but also convincing. My truth was real, but if I could not make other people believe it, it would not matter. If I could not make a jury understand that staying in an abusive family while you were a medical resident was a rational response to the coercive tactics being deployed against you, then the abuse itself would be rendered invisible. I began, during this time, to understand the magnitude of what I had initiated. I had set in motion a series of events that could not be stopped. The district attorney's office was moving forward. The hospital had begun its own internal investigation. Detective Alvarez was in contact with me regularly, gathering more information, corroborating details. My family was responding with every tool available to them. The machinery of accountability, such as it was, had been activated, and I could not, even if I wanted to, simply shut it down. My physical recovery was slower than my legal initiation. My wrist healed incorrectly from the start, and I had to have it rebroken and properly set, which was one of the more unpleasant medical experiences of my life. I spent an afternoon in the operating room being offered the opportunity to have my bones fractured again under anesthesia so that they could heal correctly, and then I spent 6 weeks in a cast while the healing occurred for Raal. The ribs took longer. I was working 30-hour shifts with broken ribs, and the experience of that was comprehensively educating in a way that no lecture on pain management could have been. I understood, finally, why people chose not to report injuries. The cost of reporting them extended far beyond the moment of the injury into every future moment of your life. Around 3 months into the legal process, my father made a final offer. He wanted to meet in person. He said he wanted to find a solution that would be good for everyone. He explained, been talking to attorneys and medical consultants, and they had developed a plan that would be attractive to me, he hoped. I met him in a conference room at Rebecca's office, with Rebecca present and the door open and every word potentially in service of the record that was being constructed. He looked older than I remembered. The weight of his daughter's legal situation seemed to have actually aged him physically, or perhaps I was simply seeing him clearly for the first time in my life, without the filter of his authority obscuring what was actually there. He was a man in his 60s who had spent his entire adult life being treated as correct, as important, as someone whose judgment should not be questioned. He had never experienced sustained institutional doubt. He was experiencing it now, and he seemed genuinely unable to compute what was happening. "We can make this go away," he said. He pulled out a document. "There's a settlement. It's significant money. Enough to pay your student loans. Enough to cover several years of housing. Enough to demonstrate that you're not simply motivated by money or vindication." The last part was particularly insulting, I thought. The suggestion that by paying me, he could frame my motivation as mercenary and thus the original injuries as fabricated. But I read the number anyway. It was substantial. It would solve almost every financial problem I had. In exchange, Rebecca said, reading ahead, Hannah would agree to a non-disclosure agreement that prevents her from discussing the incident publicly, and she would agree not to pursue further legal action against any members of the family. The goal, my father said, is simply to move forward. To let the family heal. To ensure that everyone gets what they need. What everyone needed, I understood, was a version of this that allowed my father to maintain his position at the hospital, that protected my sister from criminal charges, that preserved the family's reputation. What I needed was almost irrelevant to this formulation, except insofar as my silence could be purchased. I looked at my father across the table, and I felt something remarkable happen. I felt nothing. Not anger. Not sadness. Not even disappointment. Just a clear, cold understanding that this person, who had raised me, who had shaped my understanding of myself and the world, was not someone who could see me as a fully autonomous person with my own legitimate interests and needs. I was, to him, a problem to be managed. The fact that I could be purchased with money simply proved what he had always believed, that everyone had a price, and once you figured out what it was, you could arrange the world as you saw fit. "No," I said. "Hannah," he said, and his voice shifted into that reasonable tone that was perhaps his most dangerous tool. "Be sensible. This is a generous offer. This is more than you would receive in any lawsuit." "I don't want a settlement," I said. "I want charges filed. I want the truth to be public. I want my sister to face consequences for what she did." "Your sister is 25 years old," he said. "She has her whole life ahead of her. A criminal conviction will follow her forever. Is that what you want? Do you really want to be the person who destroyed your sister's future?" "She is the person who broke my ribs," I said. "If her future is destroyed, that's because of her actions, not mine." He stared at me for a long moment, and I watched the realization move through his face. I was not going to be moved. I was not going to be convinced. I was not going to be purchased. The machinery that had always worked on me, the combination of financial manipulation, emotional coercion, and threat of consequences, was not going to work anymore. It was not because I was stronger than I had been. It was because I had finally understood that the cost of remaining in compliance was higher than the cost of leaving. If you do this, he said very quietly, I will have nothing further to do with you. You will no longer be my daughter. We will not speak. We will not see you. And I will ensure that my colleagues understand that you are not to be trusted. The threat was real. The loss would be real. But it was a loss that I was already, in some sense, experiencing. He had never actually been present in the way that a parent should be present. He had been a conditional power, a source of resources, a man with the capacity to harm and to withhold. That was not fatherhood. That was something else. And I was ready to let it go. I understand, I said. And I'm going to do it anyway. He left the conference room then. He did not say goodbye. He did not even look at me as he exited. He simply left, the door closing quietly behind him, and I understood that I had, in some final sense, crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The charges against my sister were filed 2 weeks later. The prosecutor presented evidence to the grand jury, and they voted to indict on charges of felony assault. My father hired a criminal defense attorney for her, a man who was well respected in the state and who had successfully defended many people with significant resources. The case was assigned to the Superior Court. A trial date was set. In the months that followed, I learned that my father had been contacting hospital administration. He had offered donations. He had offered to broker connections with other wealthy donors. He had suggested that my continued employment as a resident might be reconsidered, given the reputational risks to the institution. He was, in other words, deploying every tool available to him to try to make me disappear. But something had shifted at the hospital level. Dr. Collins had spoken to people. The victim advocates had created documentation. The ethics committee, which included people who had not been directly influenced by my father, had opened an investigation into whether the hospital's processes for reporting abuse had been properly followed. I was no longer just a resident with a complicated family situation. I was a case study in how institutions respond to people with power who attempt to use that power to conceal abuse. When the hospital ultimately announced that they stood behind me, that they were implementing new protocols for handling suspected abuse involving family members of physicians, that they were commissioning a full review of reporting procedures, I felt something that I would have called triumph if I were capable of feeling triumph anymore. What I actually felt was a kind of grim satisfaction that the machinery I had activated was now grinding in the direction I had pointed it. My sister took a plea deal. She pled guilty to 1 count of felony assault, and the prosecution agreed to recommend a suspended sentence with probation and anger management classes. I was asked if I wanted to make a statement at sentencing, and I wrote one out, sitting in my small apartment at 3 a.m, trying to articulate what it had meant to have someone I shared a family with injure me and then force me to lie about it. What I tried to say was that the violence itself was significant, but the enforcement of silence after the violence was perhaps more damaging. That my sister's action was wrong, but my family's response, the construction of narrative, the threat of consequences, the attempt to make me recant, that was a different kind of wrong, one that extended the initial harm across years and through the architecture of family life itself. What I tried to say was that I was asking for justice not because I wanted to punish my sister, but because I needed to break the cycle that had been established, the cycle in which violence could occur and then be narratively erased, in which my lived experience could be overwritten by my family's need to maintain an image of respectability. I don't know if the judge understood what I was trying to articulate. I read my statement in a courtroom with my sister present, with my parents absent, with Detective Alvarez and Dr. Collins and Rebecca Sloan in the gallery. I read it steadily, without emotion, without the performance of emotion. When I finished, I sat back down, and the judge issued her sentence, and it was over. The trial itself, against my father, took much longer. The prosecutor had brought charges of retaliation and abuse of institutional power, arguing that my father's attempt to have me discredited and removed from the residency program constituted criminal coercion. It was a harder case to prove than the assault case. It required demonstrating mens rea, criminal intent, in actions that could be interpreted as the legitimate concern of a worried parent. It required proving coercion when the threats, while explicit, had been communicated in ways that were deniable. The trial lasted 2 weeks. My father testified in his own defense. He spoke about his concern for my mental health. He spoke about his relationship with the hospital and explained that his conversations with administrators had been motivated by professional obligation, not personal vendetta. He wept at one point while discussing how distressing it had been to watch his daughter have what he characterized as a mental health crisis. He was, in other words, completely and devastatingly believable if you did not know him, if you had not spent your entire life watching him construct narratives that benefited him. But I had spent my entire life watching him do that. And so had Dr. Collins. And so had Detective Alvarez. And the jury, ultimately, believed us more than they believed him. The verdict came back guilty on one charge of criminal coercion. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, suspended, with 3 years of probation and a requirement to attend a program on institutional abuse of power. His medical license was suspended pending a separate review by the state board. That last part was perhaps the most significant. The license suspension meant that he would not be able to return to practice at the hospital where he had spent his entire career. It meant that his professional identity, which had been the organizing principle of his life, was now in jeopardy. It was not the destruction of his life, but it was the disruption of the trajectory he had been on. He had genuinely believed that his reputation and his status were sufficient shields against accountability. The trial had taught him otherwise. In the weeks after the verdict, I found myself in an unexpected emotional space. I had anticipated triumph or vindication or some other clear emotional resolution. What I actually felt was a kind of exhaustion that went beyond the physical and into something more fundamental. I had been fighting to survive for so long that the absence of immediate threat felt like confusion rather than relief. Eleanor suggested that I see a therapist, and for the first time in my life, I said yes. The therapist was a woman named Dr. Adrienne Brooks, and she was trained in trauma and family systems, and she understood, on a visceral level, what it meant to grow up in a family where love was conditional and violence was hidden. We spent months talking about the ways that I had internalized my father's worldview, the ways that I had come to believe that I was responsible for managing his emotions and maintaining family image, the ways that I had sacrificed my own integrity to maintain a peace that was only ever a performance. "You're grieving," a Dr. Brooks said at one point. "You're grieving the parents you never had. And you're also, simultaneously, relieved to be free of the people you did have. That's going to be confusing. That's going to feel contradictory. That's completely normal." I was, indeed, grieving. Not for my father, who had made his choices and suffered their consequences, but for the version of my parents that I had always hoped they would be. The version that would choose me over image. The version that would prioritize my safety over their reputation. The version that would love me unconditionally rather than conditionally. Those versions did not exist, and they probably never had. But I had to grieve them anyway. A year after the trial, my father made contact. He had served his probation. His medical license had been restored with conditions. He wanted to see me. He wanted to talk about reconciliation. He wanted, I understood, to move past this. To return to a version of family life that would allow him to maintain his sense of himself as a good man, a loving father. My mother wanted the same thing, through Eleanor, who had remained in contact with both of us. My sister did not contact me. I learned later that she had moved to California and was starting a new career, and that she had, in my family's narrative, become something of a victim of my vindictiveness, a narrative that allowed them to partially rehabilitate their image. I declined to see my father. I did not refuse in a hostile or final way. I simply said that I was not ready, and that I did not know if I would ever be ready, and that I needed space to build a life that was independent of family obligation. I did not forgive him, though I worked, in therapy, on releasing some of the anger I was carrying. I did not reconcile with him, though I understood that his desire to reconcile came from a genuine place of pain and confusion. I simply maintained a boundary. I was his daughter, but I was not going to be manipulated. I was available if he could change, but I was not going to hold my life in abeyance waiting for that change. The residency continued. I finished my training, and by the end of my 3rd year, I had rebuilt my professional reputation through solid clinical work and through a series of presentations and papers on the topic of recognizing abuse patterns in the clinical setting. I had become, unexpectedly, an advocate for other residents and medical students who were in similar situations. I had become the person who could sit down with someone and say, yes, that sounds like coercion, and yes, you should report it, and yes, it's going to be hard, but you're going to survive. I moved out of the small studio apartment and into a larger one. I bought some furniture that was actually nice. I took a job at a different hospital, one where my father had no influence, where I could simply be a good doctor without the weight of family politics obscuring what I actually was and what I actually wanted to do. 3 years after the trial, I was in the hospital late one night, and I encountered a patient who reminded me, in very obvious ways, of myself. She was a young woman, educated and professional, who had come in with injuries that could theoretically be explained as an accident but whose clinical presentation told a different story. I examined her with the care that Dr. Collins had examined Catherine, with the attention to detail that suggests that something is being heard beneath the narrative that is being offered. How did this happen? I asked her. I fell, she said, and her voice was very small. Were you alone when you fell? She shook her head very slightly. That was the answer. I'm required to report this, I said. And I want to, because I think you deserve to have someone in your corner who believes you. But I want to make sure that you're ready for what comes next. Because what comes next is complicated. It's going to involve people asking questions. It's going to involve legal processes. It's going to separate you from your family, at least for a while. It's going to make everything harder before it makes anything better. But it's going to make you safe. And it's going to break the cycle. Do you want that? She cried, and then she nodded. I made the call to victim services. I documented my findings. I set in motion the machinery that I had, years before, activated for myself. I think about my family less now. I think about my parents occasionally, in the way that you think about people from your past who shaped you but with whom you no longer have active contact. My father is still alive, still working, though not at the level he once did. My mother, I hear through Eleanor, has developed some anxiety conditions and is seeing a therapist. My sister, as far as I know, is doing well in California, having rebuilt a life in a place where nobody knew her history or her family. I think more about who I am now, who I became through this experience. I think about the way that survival changes you. I think about the way that speaking truth in the face of pressure to lie is a form of courage that does not feel particularly courageous in the moment, but that becomes, over time, the ground of your sense of yourself as a person of integrity. I have a chosen family now. Eleanor, who took me in. Dr. Collins, who believed me. Detective Alvarez, who advocated for me. Rebecca Sloan, who represented me with skill and conviction. Dr. Brooks, who helped me understand myself. These are my family, not by blood but by choice, by mutual care, by the decision to show up for each other in difficult moments. The pain in my wrist never entirely went away. Some mornings, when it's cold or when I've worked a long shift, I feel the sight of the fracture, the way the bones knit themselves back together imperfectly. It's a small thing, barely worth mentioning. But it reminds me that some damage, even when healed, leaves traces. That some violence, even when addressed through the legal system, changes the landscape of your life forever. That the work of recovery is long and ongoing and never entirely complete. But I am safe now. And I am my own person now. And I did not have to die to be free of them.